Lee Van Cleef finally tells the truth about Clint Eastwood. But before that truth could be understood, you had to understand the man himself. Lee Van Cleef was born Clarence Leroy Van Cleef Jr. on January 9, 1925, in Somerville, New Jersey, far from the dusty deserts and gunfights that would later define his career. He grew up during the brutal hardships of the Great Depression, a time when nothing came easy and survival itself required grit. From a very young age, he showed a powerful sense of independence, strict self-discipline, and quiet determination, traits that didn't just shape his personality, but would later become the backbone of the intense, unshakable characters he brought to the screen. Those early struggles taught him to rely on himself, to stay focused even when the odds were stacked against him, and to never expect favors from anyone. And that mindset followed him straight into adulthood. When World War II erupted, Van Cleef answered the call and served in the United States Navy, an experience that only strengthened his respect for structure, resilience, and duty. The military didn't just test his physical limits, it sharpened his mental toughness, reinforcing the belief that discipline and endurance were the keys to survival, both in war and in life. After the war ended, many veterans struggled to find their place in a changing world, but Van Cleef made a bold decision. Instead of choosing a safe or predictable path, he turned toward acting, not as a casual hobby, but as a serious pursuit. He studied theater, trained his voice, worked on his physical presence, and committed himself fully to learning the craft. He approached acting the way a soldier approaches training, knowing that talent alone wouldn't be enough, and that success would only come through relentless effort and patience. That dedication finally paid off in 1952 when he made his film debut in High Noon, one of the most iconic westerns ever made. It was a landmark film, and although Van Cleef's role was small and nearly silent, his presence was anything but forgettable. Audiences noticed his piercing eyes, sharp features, and the quiet intensity he carried even when he wasn't speaking. In a movie filled with strong performances, he still managed to stand out, and Hollywood took notice. But the attention he received came with a price. While casting directors recognized that he had something powerful and different, they didn't quite know what to do with it. His unconventional looks, the very features that would later become legendary, were, at the time, seen as limiting. Instead of leading man roles, he was repeatedly cast as outlaws, hired guns, henchmen, and secondary villains. Again and again, he found himself playing men who lived in the shadows of the story, dangerous but disposable, memorable but rarely central. And while those roles kept him working, they also quietly built a reputation that would both help and haunt him for years to come. Throughout the 1950s, he became a familiar face across dozens of westerns and television series, appearing in shows like The Lone Ranger, Gunsmoke, and Have Gun to Travel. He was rarely the man at the center of the story, rarely the hero audiences followed from beginning to end, but every time he stepped on screen, he made himself impossible to ignore. With very few words and almost no theatrics, he could suggest danger, intelligence, and quiet authority, using nothing more than posture, a glance, or perfectly timed stillness. It was a skill that separated him from many of his peers, even if it did not yet bring him widespread fame. Despite working consistently, Van Cleef's early career was shaped more by determination and survival than by stardom or recognition. He kept showing up, kept taking roles, and kept sharpening his craft, but true breakthrough success remained just out of reach. Then, in 1958, a serious car accident abruptly stalled the momentum he had spent years building. For a while, it genuinely seemed possible that Hollywood might never fully discover what he was capable of, that his career might quietly fade before it ever truly began. But what looked like an ending slowly revealed itself as a turning point. As opportunities in American cinema began to decline, Van Cleef found an unexpected second chance overseas, especially in Italy, where filmmakers were reshaping the Western into something darker, more intense, and far more psychologically complex. These new films explored moral uncertainty, personal revenge, and emotional scars, and they needed actors who could communicate inner conflict without speeches or spectacle. In that environment, his quiet intensity suddenly became exactly what directors were searching for. His partnership with Sergio Leone would soon change everything. Cast as Colonel Douglas Mortimer in For a Few Dollars More in 1965, Van Cleef finally stepped into a role that allowed him to command the screen rather than linger on its edges. His performance felt precise, controlled, and quietly powerful, revealing layers of emotion beneath a cold, disciplined exterior. Mortimer was not a simple gunman or a stock villain. He was a man driven by grief, guided by a personal code, and haunted by loss. For the first time, audiences saw Van Cleef not just as a striking presence, but as a fully realized leading man, capable of deep emotional weight. The role transformed his career almost overnight. International audiences embraced him, critics took notice, and the industry finally began to see what had been there all along. Van Cleef followed this breakthrough with a series of unforgettable performances in films like The Good, The Bad and the Ugly in 1966, The Big Gun Down also in 1966, and Day of Anger in 1967. Again and again, he portrayed men who existed in the uneasy space between justice and vengeance, characters shaped by hard choices, painful history, and the constant need to survive. These were not heroes defined by purity, but by experience. What made these performances so powerful was how real they felt. He never exaggerated violence or tried to glorify heroism. Instead, he let silence, hesitation, and subtle reaction carry the weight of each moment. Strength came through restraint, not bravado, and danger came through calm, not chaos. Audiences believed his characters because they felt like men who had truly lived the lives they were portraying. Every movement suggested a past filled with battles already fought and losses already suffered. What ultimately set Lee Van Cleef apart was not just his distinctive appearance or his connection to a revolutionary film movement, but the way he treated his work and the people around him. Off-screen, he was known for being reserved and respectful, approaching acting as a serious craft rather than a shortcut to celebrity. Fellow actors and crew members often described him as disciplined, polite, and deeply committed to every role, no matter how large or small. He never forgot the long years of struggle that came before success, and even when international fame finally arrived, he carried himself with the same quiet humility that had defined him from the beginning. In his later years, Van Cleef found himself returning to American productions, stepping back into Hollywood with renewed purpose and unmistakable authority. One of his most memorable late-career appearances came in Escape from New York in 1981, where he portrayed the stern and morally complex police commissioner, Bob Hawke. It was a role that perfectly matched the weight of his presence. Once again, Van Cleef didn't just play the part, he elevated it. His calm intensity and weathered authority gave the character a sense of realism and gravity that grounded the film, reminding audiences that even as he aged, his screen power had not faded. If anything, it had deepened. Rather than slowing down, Van Cleef continued to work steadily, carefully choosing roles that suited his experience, his commanding voice, and the hard-earned confidence of a man who had truly lived the life his characters suggested. Behind that powerful screen image, however, was a personal life that remained largely private, shaped by loyalty, difficult transitions, and an eventual search for stability. Much like the rugged, morally conflicted figures he played so convincingly, Van Cleef's real-life journey through love and family was marked by perseverance and quiet endurance. He married his first wife, Patsy Ruth Kay, in 1943, right in the middle of the turbulent years of World War II, when the future felt uncertain for millions of young Americans. At that time, Van Cleef was still a young man trying to find his place in the world, long before his sharp cheekbones and piercing stare would turn him into an icon of Western cinema. Their marriage coincided with his service in the United States Navy, where he faced the rigid discipline of military life and later suffered an injury that caused lasting physical challenges. Those experiences didn't just shape the course of his life, they would later influence the stoic, restrained, and hardened characters he became famous for portraying on screen. Together, Van Cleef and Kay built a family, welcoming 3 children during their years together. These were not glamorous times. They were years defined by responsibility, financial pressure, and constant uncertainty. Van Cleef struggled through the early stages of his acting career, taking whatever small roles he could find, many of them uncredited, while also working various jobs simply to keep food on the table. Fame was nowhere in sight, and success felt painfully distant. Even with the love they shared and the strong bond of raising children together, the strain of chasing an unstable dream slowly wore them down. Ambition, money worries, and the unpredictable nature of the film industry began to pull at the foundation of their marriage. After 15 years together, the couple divorced in 1958, closing an important chapter in Van Cleef's life. Though the marriage ended, the legacy of those years lived on through their children and the sacrifices made during his long climb toward recognition. Then, in 1960, as his career cautiously began to recover after a serious horseback riding accident had temporarily pushed him out of work, Van Cleef married again, this time to Joan Marjorie Drain. This second marriage took place during a moment of transition, both personally and professionally. He was no longer the desperate newcomer fighting for scraps of screen time, but he also had not yet reached the international fame that would later redefine his career. Drain stood beside him during these rebuilding years, when he worked steadily in television and film, often cast as villains or morally grey characters, roles that made full use of his sharp features, cold stare, and intimidating calm. These roles didn't always bring huge fame, but they kept him visible, relevant, and slowly building toward something bigger. Even so, the demands of his profession continued to take their toll. Long periods apart, constant travel, and the emotional weight of maintaining relationships under career pressure created familiar strains. Despite lasting more than a decade, this second marriage also struggled under the same forces that had challenged the first: distance, exhaustion, and the difficulty of balancing personal life with a consuming career. In 1974, the relationship ended in divorce, almost at the same time that Lee Van Cleef's career was reaching new heights overseas, fueled by his legendary collaborations with Sergio Leone and other Italian filmmakers. Ironically, just as global fame finally arrived, stability at home once again slipped out of reach. Finally, in 1976, Lee Van Cleef found what had long escaped him: lasting companionship. He married Barbara Havalone, at a moment when his career had climbed to a new level of respect and international recognition. By then, he was no longer just the familiar supporting figure or the menacing face behind a villain's glare. He had become a star in his own right, celebrated across the world for his unforgettable performances in spaghetti westerns and hard-edged action films. This marriage brought him something fame never had: stability, peace, and a quiet sense of belonging. With Barbara, Van Cleef experienced a kind of comfort that had been missing through the restless and uncertain years of his earlier life. Their bond carried them through the later chapters of his career and through the slow, difficult decline of his health. When illness entered the picture, Barbara stayed close, offering steady companionship and strength as he faced each day with the same calm toughness that had defined his screen persona for decades. When Lee Van Cleef passed away in 1989, Barbara Havalone remained behind, a living reminder of the devotion they had shared in his final years. For much of his life, Lee Van Cleef had been known simply as the man with the unforgettable face, the sharp features, the cold, piercing eyes, and a screen presence so powerful it could dominate a scene without a single word of dialogue. But behind that intimidating image of the perfect cinematic villain was a thoughtful, observant actor who understood Hollywood's inner workings better than most. And late in life, Van Cleef finally spoke openly about the man most closely tied to his legacy, Clint Eastwood. What he shared was not driven by resentment or rivalry, but by honesty, shaped through years of experience and quiet reflection. "I think people like to imagine that Clint and I were rivals," Van Cleef once said, "but the truth is simpler than that. We were two men doing our jobs, walking very different paths that just happened to cross at the right moment." He openly acknowledged that Clint Eastwood entered the Italian Western scene with powerful momentum, youthful energy, and an instinctive sense of how little he needed to do to command attention on screen. Clint knew the power of stillness, Van Cleef explained. He didn't rush. He let the camera come to him. That's something you can't teach. Van Cleef admitted that the first time he worked beside Eastwood for a few dollars more, he immediately sensed something rare was happening. You could feel it. The crew felt it. The audience felt it. To Van Cleef, Eastwood wasn't just portraying another gunslinger. He was transforming into a symbol. Still, he was careful to point out that Eastwood's rise wasn't a matter of luck or coincidence. He worked for that image. He protected it. He understood that silence, restraint, and confidence were his strongest weapons. And while Eastwood's climb to superstardom happened fast and visibly, Van Cleef's own career moved along a far more winding, unpredictable road, one shaped by setbacks, late recognition, and resilience that rarely made headlines, but mattered just as much. Most people thought Clint Eastwood was the hero of those westerns, but Lee Van Cleef never saw himself as second place. He saw himself as something different, and in many ways, something just as powerful. He spoke about the contrast between himself and Clint without bitterness and without regret. Clint, he admitted, fit the American myth almost perfectly. Tall, calm, steady, heroic, in a clean, modern way. I didn't, he said. My face told different stories. I was danger. I was the man you weren't supposed to trust. And instead of fighting that image, I accepted it. More than that, I learned how to use it, how to turn it into a weapon. Van Cleef believed his revival in Italian cinema proved something important, that success didn't come in only one shape, and legends weren't made from a single mold. I didn't need to be the hero, he once said. I needed to be unforgettable. And he rejected the idea that Clint Eastwood somehow eclipsed him. In fact, he believed the opposite was true. If anything, he explained, Clint helped define me. Without that contrast, without the clean hero standing opposite the morally grey hunter, for a few dollars more would never have carried the same tension, the same electricity. The danger only worked because the calm was there too. The balance mattered. The opposition mattered. And he never spoke of rivalry. He spoke of respect. Clint showed up prepared. He respected the work, and to Van Cleef, that was the highest compliment one actor could give another. But the most revealing words he ever shared weren't really about Clint at all. They were about legacy, about how time decides who becomes a star and who becomes something else entirely. Clint became a legend, first in front of the camera and then behind it, a leading man who turned into a master filmmaker. Van Cleef saw his own path differently. "People remember my eyes," he said, "my walk, my silence." And then he added, softly but with certainty, "That's a kind of immortality too." In his mind, time eventually placed every artist exactly where they belonged. Hollywood, he reflected, is loud when you're young, applause, headlines, bright lights everywhere. But when the noise finally fades, only the truth remains. So, in the end, Van Cleef's words about Clint Eastwood were never confessional and never confrontational. They were calm, measured, deeply human. "Clint Eastwood earned what he became," Van Cleef said, "and I earned what I became. We were never meant to be the same man. We were meant to stand across from each other, framed in dust and sunlight, and let the audience decide which kind of legend they needed." And in saying that, Van Cleef wasn't only telling the truth about Eastwood, he was finally telling the truth about himself, and about the quiet dignity of carving out your own place in cinematic history. And even as his body began to fail him, Lee Van Cleef never surrendered his devotion to the screen. From the 1970s onward, he lived with serious heart disease, a condition that would have convinced many to retreat into silence and rest, but Van Cleef refused to step away. By the 1980s, a pacemaker had been implanted to regulate his weakening heart, a constant mechanical reminder that time was no longer on his side, but also a silent partner that allowed him to keep working, to keep creating, to keep standing under the lights. And still, as his health declined, his presence never softened. The intensity was still there, the precision, the cold, magnetic menace that had defined him for decades. To the very end, Lee Van Cleef remained a working actor, refusing to let physical weakness erase the fierce spirit that had carried him from forgotten bit parts to international stardom. A man who never stopped showing up and never stopped earning the place he carved for himself on screen. He spent a lifetime staring down death on screen, but when it finally came for real, it arrived quietly, without an audience. On December 16, 1989, the long, unbreakable road finally came to its quiet end. Lee Van Cleef collapsed from a sudden heart attack inside his home in Oxnard, California, far from flashing cameras, crowded sets, and roaring applause, in a still, private space that could not have been more different from the larger-than-life figures he had spent decades carving into movie history. Later, throat cancer was listed as a contributing cause of death, a painful reminder that his final years were shaped not just by age, but by constant physical struggle and battles he fought far from the spotlight. And yet, even in death, Lee Van Cleef's story is not one of defeat. It is a story of endurance, of an artist who kept standing, kept working, kept captivating audiences long after his own body began to fail him. While many would have stepped away, he continued to show up, continued to perform, and continued to leave his mark. He was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park Cemetery in the Hollywood Hills, a resting place that feels fitting for a man whose presence is permanently woven into the very fabric of classic cinema. Etched into his grave marker are the words, "Best of the Bad." Simple, direct, impossible to forget. Just 3 words, yet somehow powerful enough to carry the weight of an entire career. They honor not only his unforgettable portrayals of villains, outlaws, and anti-heroes, but also the rare artistry and quiet charisma he brought to characters that, in lesser hands, might have been nothing more than disposable bad guys. Because Lee Van Cleef did not merely play villains, he elevated them. He gave them sharp intelligence, controlled menace, and a chilling elegance that made every stare feel dangerous and every silence feel heavy with meaning. Long after the final credits rolled, those faces, those eyes, those moments stayed with the audience. And that is why, in life and in death, he remains a towering figure in classic cinema, resilient, uncompromising, and forever, without question, the best of the bad. But maybe that's the real twist in Lee Van Cleef's story. The man who made a career out of playing villains ended up becoming unforgettable, not because he fell, but because he refused to fade. And long after the guns went silent, his shadow is still standing in the frame.